Okay, the recording has begun, and I will go ahead and give introductions for our speaker. Wendy L. Rouse is a professor of history at San Jose State University. Her scholarly research focuses on the history of women, gender, and sexuality during the Progressive Era. Rouse's most recent work, Public Faces, Secret Lives, The Queer History of the Women's Suffrage Movement, explores the ways that suffragists challenged norms of gender and sexuality in their era. Rouse is also the author of Children of Chinatown, Growing Up Chinese American in San Francisco, 1880 to 1920, and her own hero, The Origins of the Women's Self-Defense Movement. Please give a warm virtual welcome to Wendy Rouse.
Thank you. Okay, I'm super excited to be here. Thank you all for dialing in. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. You can see the presentation. So I am always so grateful to be able to share my research and hear your thoughts on it. So if at any point in time you have a question, please do put your question in the Q&A because I'd love to answer it at the end. My research on this project really kind of begins and ends with Dr. Mary Edwards Walker, who is on the cover of the book, as you can see here in this picture of the book. So I want to start by explaining a little bit about her. In 1880, she was arrested for she asked the police, what am I being arrested for? And they said it was because she was wearing men's clothing. And she responded by saying, I don't wear men's clothing, I wear my own clothing. And that kind of exemplifies a lot of what we're going to be talking about today, right? Because Dr. Mary Edwards Walker was really kind of pushing the norm for the time when it comes to women's rights and the women's suffrage movement and whatnot. Here's some more photos of Dr. Walker. And as you can see, Dr. Walker's gender queer appearance, right, was very out of the norm for the era, very radical. And it wasn't the first time that she had been arrested. She'd actually been arrested multiple times in different cities. And in many ways, it was done on purpose to make a point, right? That she had been a lifelong women's rights activist, and she was a dress reformer. So she was advocating for women's right to wear whatever clothes they wanted. And so she's really an interesting character. So I'll come back to her in just a second, but this project was something I had in mind for some time as I was researching and learning more and more about the women's suffrage movement. I teach US history at the university level. I taught it at the high school level. And I've always been fascinated by the women's suffrage movement and specifically by the lives of these individual women who were campaigning for the vote. And as I did more and more research, I started to wonder about the queer history of the movement, specifically the queer lives of some of these individuals who I was coming across. And I had proposed early on to do this project. I said, you know, I really want to write about their lives, their romantic relationships, the queer history of the movement. And every time I proposed it, people told me that it would be very difficult, if not impossible, to find evidence of their queer lives. Most people kind of discouraged me, said I probably wouldn't find anything, and they didn't know that it was worth the time. But I was surprised by what I was able to find. Their concerns were absolutely valid, and they were right in many ways, because the truth is that so much of the queer history of the suffrage movement is obscured. It's difficult to come across. Obviously, women's history in general, as you know, there's a problem with erasure. We have sexism that comes into play. We have homophobia in the case of queer folks. We have transphobia. And obviously that plays a role in contributing to the historical erasure of folks in the past. And of course, the suffragists are responsible to some extent for this in obscuring their own personal lives. And obviously their descendants also, you know, play a role in this and contributing to that erasure. And so it becomes kind of a difficult process of going through and restoring this history to some extent. And so I'll talk about that more as we go through. Just to return again to this era, right? It's the early 20th century, the late 19th century. And this idea of women voting is very radical. Suffragists were really pushing the boundaries of what's acceptable for women through their activism. So many suffrage leaders at the time were doing things that were just considered not normal for respectable women. And they believed, a lot of the suffrage leaders believed, if they were going to win popular support for the vote, they were going to have to present themselves in as respectable of light as possible, considering that in their activism, they were pushing the norms. So this often meant highlighting their roles as wives and mothers. And this was often in stark contrast to these other ideas, right, about womanhood. And this is in part because here we see anti-suffragists who are mocking them for being more masculine, mannish women. So this is a postcard, very popular among anti-suffragists at the time, to include postcards like this, where they're basically saying that these suffragists, these women's rights activists, are wearing mannish clothing, right? Taking the image of Dr. Mary Edwards Walker and kind of making a cartoon of it, and basically saying, this is the problem with these suffragists, is that they want to be literally the men. They want to literally wear the pants. And so we see all of these anti-suffrage cartoons that really kind of push back against this idea of suffragists getting the right to vote, that it will just up in the existing norms, that this whole status quo will be changed, and it will result in complete dysfunction of society. So here you see a man, and he's literally like forced to do the laundry and take care of the children. And he says he wants to vote, but his wife won't let him, right? Everybody works but mother, because she's a suffragist. And so this is kind of that idea that men would become more feminine and women would become more masculine, and it would result in the downfall of society. And of course, embedded in this criticism about the suffrage movement was a suggestion of sexual abnormality, that these suffragists weren't just defying gender norms, that they were also almost becoming men, right? And that they, in some ways, would be more likely to pursue relationships with each other. So there's a little hint in some of the anti-suffrage propaganda about fear of same-sex relationships, of women, of lesbianism to some extent. And so you see this all reflected in the postcards. And so in response to this, then, the anti-suffrage leaders, as I mentioned, they're concerned about propping up an image of respectability. In contrast to folks like Dr. Mary Edwards Walker, right? They want to emphasize more their heterosexual, heteronormative respectability, middle-class standards. So they literally would parade with their children to show that they are wives, that they are mothers, and that they are good wives and mothers. That, again, they're middle class, white, the symbol of purity. Notice that they're waving the flag, right? This patriotism, they're good American citizens. And this is in part to push back against that suggestion that they were not normal women in that sense. So people like Dr. Mary Edwards Walker, then, these very queer suffragists in that concept of that time, are considered completely too radical by mainstream suffragists. So we're talking about like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, right? They had been dress reformers in their past. They had tried to push that dress reform agenda. And what they discovered is that they were met by so much hostility for their appearance that they felt like it detracted from their larger message about women's political equality. So they pushed back against folks like Dr. Mary Edwards Walker, who continued along that vein and said, you know, we really need to emphasize the fight for political equality, and we need to downplay these larger issues. And so in response, then, they kind of push Walker to the edge of the movement, right, to the outside of the movement, and they try to disassociate themselves from Walker. And this has the effect, then, of concealing some of the queerness of the women's suffrage movement. I mean, they literally tried to write Walker out of the history of the women's suffrage movement. As you know, as you probably know, like that Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote a book on the history of the women's suffrage movement. And in that book, they actually have a conversation while they're writing that book about how much they should emphasize Walker's role. And they decide that they don't really want to mention her much at all. And so that's just an example of how queer folks get kind of minimized or erased in the movement. And then, of course, as I mentioned, some suffragists themselves minimize their queer history, their queer past. They hide evidence of their queer love affairs and whatnot. Sometimes we have them literally burning their own letters because they're concerned about their reputation in public and they don't want folks to maybe know, or descendants or biographers and whatnot. So then it becomes very difficult when I say I want to write this history, or when other folks want to look into it, because you're literally looking for what's left, right? The scraps, the remnants, and trying to piece it together to try to understand someone's life history. So before I dive into some of the folks that I want to talk to you about today, I want to emphasize the language that I'm using and clarify exactly. So I use the term queer throughout this talk, and I use it as kind of an umbrella term, right? To talk about suffragists who challenged the sexual and gender norms of their era. If they were alive today, they might identify as lesbian, gay, trans, non-binary, gender non-conforming, queer, right? We don't know how they would identify exactly. Maybe they would identify as asexual, aromantic. But those words, that language that we use now, didn't exist back then. So generally speaking, we try not to impose our modern terms on folks in the past, because we don't know if they had those terms, we don't know which term they would use to identify themselves. So queer is a broader term in that sense, in the way that I'm using it. And I don't want to use LGBTQ plus necessarily, because again, we don't know if they would even identify per se with that. So again, I use the term queer to say that they pushed back against the gender and sexual norms of their day. So some of these folks are huge leaders in the movement, like really central characters, and some of them are these kind of outcasts, like Dr. Mary Edwards Walker. And when I talk about the queer history of the suffrage movement, I'm also sometimes talking about individuals. If you read the book, I'm talking about individuals who maybe wouldn't identify as queer at all by today's standards as LGBTQ plus, but they were really, really shifting the ideas about family, about domesticity, and even notions of death. So I talk about that in the book. There's so many interesting stories, honestly, that I could pull out of this. And I always have to pick when I'm giving a presentation what I want to talk about. So I'm going to focus on a few folks that I think you'll find interesting. Another really cool person, in addition to Dr. Mary Edwards Walker, is Annie Tinker. She was actually born in the generation after Walker. She's after the early 20th century, very active in the movement. She also, as you can see, refused to conform to gendered notions about how a woman should dress. And she is really well known because she led a New York suffrage parade. She led a cavalry of suffragists on horseback through the streets, dressed in this kind of masculine attire. And the press even called her out for her like mannish attire. And they interviewed her. And when they interviewed her, she stepped into the spotlight and took that spotlight and basically used that time to advocate for women's right, not only to dress how they please, not only for women's right to vote, but for women's right to pursue the career of her choice. Because they even asked her, you're writing in this cavalry of suffragists, do you want to join the military? And she said, if a woman wants to join the military, she should be able to if she wants. So she's really, challenging those ideas. Another example of a queer suffragist is Dr. Margaret Chung. Dr. Margaret Chung challenged gender conventions, not only by her appearance, as you can see here, she liked to be called Mike by her friends. She wore a men's hat. She wore a men's jacket. She carried a cane, and she was known for like her more masculine type of behaviors, like smoking and gambling and swearing. But she was also pushing back against these gendered notions of what a woman can do. She was the first Chinese American physician in her era in California, and she fought back against xenophobia and racism against the Chinese American community. She challenged the segregationist policies in California, the exclusion policies when it came to immigration. And so she was really pushing for more than the mainstream suffragists, right? She's really challenging the norms in that sense as well. And then we have Alice Dunbar Nelson. Alice was a Black suffragist who was not only fighting for the right of women to vote, right, but she's also pushing back against these notions of equality within the movement. She challenges the role that that white women take toward Black women in the movement. She challenges this idea of that the only issue that they need to fight for is the vote, right? She's fighting against discrimination. She's fighting against racialized violence against the Black community. And so she is very well known within the movement. She actually works with NAFA and becomes a speaker and travels around giving speeches for suffrage. And what's interesting about her queer life is that publicly she presented herself as a very respectable heterosexual married woman. She actually, when her husband died, she emphasized her status as a widow. She would always appear in public appearances as Mrs. Paul Lawrence Dunbar. Instead of using her own name, she used her husband's name, in part because he was a well-known poet, and that gave her some status in society, right? But she emphasized this image. At the same time, however, her romantic life, she was pursuing romantic and sexual relationships with women at the time. I talk about that in the book. There are letters between her and one of her female lovers. And this is never made public or is anything that anyone would necessarily know about her at the time, because she wanted to emphasize her heterosexual respectability because it gained her more status in some sense in society. But it does reveal her life, and her story reveals this kind of subculture among the Black women's community at the time. Lesbian and bisexual women, if they were alive today, they might identify as, or pansexual. But it reveals that these folks that are kind of pushing the norm in their own time period. And then there's also the story of Albert Eugene DeForest, and he is actually from San Jose. So I like to emphasize his story a bit because it's close to where I live and work. Albert was assigned female at birth and went to a women's college at Vassar. At that women's college, he met Dr. Alida Avery, who was the physician at the university at the time and kind of became his mentor. And then later on, he married a man, and then he went on and became an actor in Oakland, in the Bay Area, and began to wear men's clothing. And at that point in time, he was concerned that he might be arrested for wearing men's clothing because a lot of cities had anti-cross-dressing laws. So he got permission from the local police to be able to wear men's clothing. And Dr. Avery helped him because this was, they had both moved at this point in time to San Francisco. And she actually helped him get permission from the police to wear the clothing. And eventually, after his husband died, he fully transitioned and identified as a man and wore men's clothing permanently, and actually took out an ad in the newspaper at the time, the Oakland Berkeley newspaper, and basically declared his new identity, his new name, and his new identity, and introduced himself as a gentleman. What's interesting about DeForest is he was a suffragist. Dr. Alida Avery was a very prominent suffragist in San Jose. He lived with her. He felt that this was his mentor, his adopted mother. He also relied on Clara Foltz, who was also a very well-known suffragist in California, a lawyer, a woman's attorney in California. And this was kind of his chosen family. So in the book, I talk about this idea of chosen family, that many of these queer suffragists really did have to create a community of their own. He in the area and everyone knew his gender history for the most part because he had publicly transitioned. And then after Dr. Avery dies, he moves down to LA. And at that point, people do not know his gender history. And he ends up being arrested because someone reveals that to the police and accuses him of impersonating a man. And he has to go through the criminal system. Clara Foltz then comes in and actually defends him with the police, and essentially his chosen family comes in here and provides that support network, his chosen family of suffragists. So I talk more about his story in the book, and you can read more about what happens there, but he's another prominent suffragist that really reflects this queer trans history of the suffrage movement. So that's just a few of the examples. And again, there's so many different stories that I could tell here today. But but I often feel like I'm just kind of like pulling out examples and running through them very quickly. And I want to focus in on one suffragist story specifically, because I think this one really kind of exemplifies a lot of the history of this movement. In the very beginning of my research, when I wasn't sure I was going to find very much, and I thought about maybe this isn't a project worth pursuing, maybe I should just give up. I was in the archives and I was really struggling to find anything at all. And finally, I came across some hints in the story of Alice Morgan Wright. And this is what kind of helped me hang on to this project and move forward. So I want to tell you now about Alice Morgan Wright and kind of how I went about uncovering her queer history. So Alice was a suffragist, obviously, and folks had suggested that, she had a companion later in her life, a woman that she spent a lot of time with, and that perhaps she was queer. So that's kind of how that all started in the very beginning. I was skimming her papers in the archives. She had a large collection that she had donated to Smith College, and I wasn't finding much of anything at first. There wasn't anything overt. There wasn't any romantic love letters or anything between her and any woman. But what I did notice is that she had a notebook of poems that she had drafted in college. And many of these poems were just, scribbled remnants of her drafts, thoughts at the time. They weren't always very coherent. But as I read these poems, I noticed that a lot of them seemed to be about pain and heartbreak. And one of them in particular was interesting because it talked about what seemed to be like her love for another woman. In this poem, she imagines herself as a king, and this other woman is a queen, and they live together and they love freely. They live in this magical world of poppies and rainbow mountains, and it's kind of a world that they make for themselves. And love is enough. Their love is enough in this world. And they say that they don't need anything else but each other, and they walk hand in hand and side by side. And it seems like everything's perfect and harmonious. And she says that life is but a fairy song, right? But then the poem shifts and she talks about the sun rising, the dawn breaking, and the love dying from her lover's eyes. Reality dawns, and she talks about the world of things that are appears, and the world of things that seem fade away. And as it comes to an end, Alice clings to this memory of this amazing life that they had together. And she just goes on to imagine you with me through the waking years. So first of all, you have to know this poem really moved me emotionally when I read it. It resonated with me on many levels as a queer person. And then I thought, am I really seeing here what I'm seeing, right? What I think I'm seeing? And I thought, in some senses, this represents potentially an expression of queer desire, kind of a coming to terms with the reality that they can't really live in public together, right? That they live in a world that denies them the ability to live and love openly in that light of day. But it wasn't enough per se for me to necessarily say that Alice, was queer. But it was just an interesting poem that was really moving and had this kind of obvious connection to queer history. So I wanted to know more. And what I found is that if you piece together the fragments, the little hints, right? These scribbled poems in the back of her notebooks, these kind of affections for other women that she had, and some of these other hints about her life, then you begin to see the whole of her queer history and her story. So let me tell you more about what I learned. So Alice Morgan Wright was a hopeless romantic, from what I can tell. She fell in love with several women during her life, and you can see that through these poems expressed in her college writings. I don't know who all these women were that she fell for. She never named them per se, but you can see evidence in these poems, in these letters. And later on, I found letters from classmates who talked about Alice falling for other women. And this is just one of those pictures that helped kind of like complete this idea of Alice's queer history. If you look, it's clear that there's some sort of relationship here. I like the way that Alice is kind of defying gender norms with her leg up on the log and her arm kind of over it nonchalantly. She's really telling a story, I think, with this image alone. But one of Alice's closest friends was Edith Good. She went to college with Edith. It seems like during college they were just kind of friends, not very close. They became closer later in life. In Edith's letters, because I found some of Edith's letters from her college and her post-college days. And she had written these to another woman, and I found them in the other woman's archive. Alice talked about, Edith talked about how Alice was in love with another of their friends. And Edith said that Alice held no sway over her. She wasn't interested in her at all. And she said, being with Alice is like reading a French novel, a touch of philosophy, a lot of emotion, and a strange character only partly revealed. So at this point, Edith is, is more skeptical of Alice. So after college, Alice leaves the United States. She actually moves to Europe. She wants to study sculpture, and she actually becomes very well known for her sculpture over the next decade or so of her life, almost 2 decades of her life. And while crossing the Atlantic Ocean on a steamer to go begin her study in Paris, she actually meets Emmeline Pankhurst. Now, I don't know if you know who Emmeline Pankhurst is, but she is the leader of the militant suffrage movement in England. She's very well known as kind of a rabble rouser in the United Kingdom for her suffrage activism. And Alice knows exactly who she is, and she is just kind of overwhelmed with joy upon meeting Emmeline. And I have letters that Alice wrote to her friends, and she's talking about, oh my gosh, I met Emmeline Pankhurst, you're never going to believe it. And there's a sense of not only hero worship in there, but some kind of romantic infatuation through her letters. Once they reach London, Emmeline disembarks to go on into her suffrage work, and Alice moves on to Paris. But Alice continued to write Pankhurst in an attempt to keep in touch. And Emmeline, honestly, it appears that she just viewed Wright as just another one of the young women in the movement who hero worshipped her. But she did write back to her. She encouraged her in her work, recommended she keep up her studies. And she told her all about what was happening in the suffrage movement, talking about the heroic marches, the arrests, and the imprisonment of some of the British suffragists. Now, at this point in time in Britain, you have to know that the suffragists were completely fed up. They had spent years petitioning the government, begging for the men in power to give them the vote, and there had been pretty much zero change. So under Emmeline Pankhurst's leadership, the suffragists, they shifted their tactics. They used marches and demonstrations to get the government's attention, and this led to increasingly violent confrontations with the police. This is Emmeline Pankhurst, by the way. And so as these increasingly intense conflicts with the police heated up, more and more suffragists were physically and sexually assaulted in these demonstrations. There's a infamous demonstration that occurred known as Black Friday, and it ended in violence when the police brutally beat hundreds of suffragists in the streets of London. Emmeline's own sister later died from injuries sustained on Black Friday. And she finally decided that enough was enough. And she said, it's time for suffragists to turn their words into deeds, right? She said, deeds, not words. That was the slogan. And she gave a fiery speech to a crowd of women in London. She said, why should women go to Parliament and be battered about and insulted? We've submitted for years patiently to insult and assault, and women have lost their lives. She declared that they're no longer going to let the government break their bodies. And she said, we're going to break glass instead. So Alice is reading about this in Paris. She's reading about what's happening in London. And it's too hard for her to just sit back and watch. She had been active in suffrage and as a student, and now she wanted to be active in this, what she considered like this historical moment in British history. So she leaves Paris, goes to London in March of 1912, and she participates in this mass window campaign that Pankhurst had called for. She's literally arrested holding a stone in her hand, about to break a window. And it said, taxation without representation is tyranny. There's a paper wrapped around the stone. The judge sentenced her to 2 months in jail, and she went to jail that night with hundreds of other suffragists. Now, Alice's parents, this is the arrest record, by the way, for Alice. I was able to find it in the files of the British suffragettes that were arrested. Now, Alice's parents back home in New York were absolutely frustrated, angry. I mean, just completely shocked when they heard that their daughter had been arrested in London. And they heard in part because it was the headlines of many of the American papers. It said, "American girl arrested in London." So her father immediately starts consulting lawyers to try to figure out what he can do to get her released from prison. Her mother rushes to England, gets on a steamer and tries to get to England to beg authorities for her daughter's release. And in jail, the suffragettes are all continuing the protest. They launch a hunger strike, and Alice joins that hunger strike. She refuses to take any food whatsoever. And then the government started force feeding the suffragettes. This was a horrific ordeal, the force feeding. The nurses would hold the women down. The doctors would shove plastic tubes down their throats or through their nostrils. And then raw eggs and milk were poured directly into their stomachs. Suffragists, they vomited, they bled, they endured great pain through these violent procedures. And some were so ill from the procedures or so weak afterwards that they were on their death's edge, right? And so they had to be released in some instances to preserve their life. They did what they could in prison to keep their spirits up through all of this. They sang songs and whatnot. And Alice worried as she waited. She worried most about Emmeline, because Emmeline Pankhurst had been separated from the other suffragettes because they knew she was their leader. They didn't want her to encourage the suffragettes in any way. And nobody could interact with her. So Alice worried about Emmeline, and she spent her time in prison actually writing poems to Emmeline. So these were very difficult to read. They're on these tiny scraps of paper that the suffragists had kind of smuggled into the prison so that they could write notes to others, and they're in pencil and crossed out and whatnot. But this one was legible, and it basically says, "4 walls go round my prison floor, and then somewhere beyond your cell is." Then later on she says, "Can prison walls put out the stars or take away my love for you? What if today and yesterday have given me no sight of you? It's enough the whole night through to think that perhaps tomorrow may. I think, although you do not know, your heart must be a little gay because of me, since day by day and hour by hour, I love you so." So there were other poems to Emmeline, but this one's, I think, the most overt in her expressions of love toward the suffragette leader. Now, Alice was a sculptor. She had a tiny bit of clay that she had smuggled in put in her socks and smuggled in. And she actually sculpted a bust of Emmeline while she was in prison. And this is now at Smith College in the archives. And it's a very tiny little bust of Emmeline Pankhurst. So there was no romance that ever developed between Alice and Emmeline. Obviously, Alice had a crush on her, but Emmeline, again, had many of these young women had crushes on Emmeline. So I think it just shows you, though, how important, in some senses, these queer relationships were, whether they were friendships, whether they were crushes or full-on sexual affairs, because they bind the suffragists together in common cause, right? It helps forge alliances, and in this case, literally forge an alliance across the Atlantic, because Alice would come back to the United States and help sponsor Emmeline here in the US to do talks. She would actually bring her to her hometown of Albany to give talks. So it really did kind of forge these intense alliances among suffragists, these intense relationships. And queer suffragists were front and center of the suffrage movement. They were often the first to go to the front lines, the first to submit their bodies to police assault, the first to endure arrest, imprisonment, hunger strikes, and even undergo forced feeding for the cause. Now, while Alice is in Europe, right, her friend Edith Good from college was also fighting for women's right to vote here in the United States. Edith was working with the Congressional Union, which later became the National Women's Party. Edith was traveling the country, helping organize a speaking tour for the suffrage cause. She was inspired by what was happening in England, and the Congressional Union began to borrow the past. They began picketing the White House. They had the parade in 1913, and then they start picketing the White House in the Silent Sentinel protests. And many of these women are arrested in the United States, and they also go on hunger strike. They also endure forced feeding. So here again, we see many of these women are queer suffragists as well. And they're the first on the line, go to prison, right? They endure hunger strikes and forced feeding for the cause. So Alice and Edith end up reuniting in the later years. Alice comes back from Europe, and it's the suffrage movement that brings them back together again, that kind of allows them to get to know each other again. They both became active, or Edith continued her activism with the National Women's Party, and then Alice becomes active in the National Women's Party. And work not only on the campaign for the vote, but once that's achieved through the Equal Rights Amendment. And so they continue their activism into the 20s and into the 30s for women's rights. And Edith seems to no longer object to Alice's philosophical, emotional, and strange character. In fact, it seems she begins to like it. So in the years after their career as suffragists, they become partners. Neither one of them married. They end up spending most of their time together. They keep their own houses. They have like their own like family houses, but they spend much of their time in Woodstock, Vermont, where Wright opens up a studio, and Edith's family farm was there, and they lived together up there for many months of the year. And friends would visit them. Friends would inquire about them, about each other in their correspondence, right? They would address letters to both of them and whatnot. And so it's really interesting the way that their relationship develops over the next decades. They continue their activism, like I said, in the National Women's Party, fighting for the Equal Rights Amendment. They actually become active in the United Nations. They work with a delegation of women from around the world to adopt a Declaration of Full Equality for men and women with the Commission of the Status of Women. Alice and Edith are very active, though, in the animal rights movement. That's what they become most well known for later in their life. Together, they actually found the National Humane Education Society, and they work for the humane treatment of animals. And this is Alice later in her life with some of the animals that they had rescued. So again, uncovering evidence of their relationship was difficult, in part because there was no letters between them, which just definitively reveal it, right? And this kind of was curious to me because we know that queer history often gets erased because people want to destroy the letters later in their life. But at the same time, I was wondering, because there was so much in Alice's archive that had been donated, that I knew that there must have been letters between them at some point. What I did find is in some of those old notebooks with the scribbled out drafts of poems, I did find some Valentine's Day poems that were written on February 14th. Year after year, she would always write a Valentine's Day poem. Most of these it wasn't clear who they were to, but at least one of them had the initials AJG, which is Edith Good's initials. And these poems really reflect her deep and enduring love for Alice. One of them said, "My hands are torn by the spokes I clutch as the wheeling years go by, and the dust of their passing graze my head, and my ears are dim with the dust they shed. And think how, year by year, I love my lovely dear. She is my noonday bright, she is my starry night. She is my heart's delight, my very dear." And then there's this poem which talks about, compares Edith to a doe. And it's just, these are very loving poems that really do reveal the depth of Alice's love for Edith. Later in their life, Alice and Edith both have their share of health problems. They took turns caring for each other, as is evidenced by the records. At one point, they actually end up in the hospital together at the same time. And Alice wrote to a friend to describe how they would stay connected even though they were in different wards. Alice said, "Every morning at 10:30, I hobble across the street and I wave at her window, from which at first her nurse and then she waves back at me." So it's really interesting, this relationship that they have. One day I finally found the answer that I was looking for about what happened to the letters between them. There was a letter that was written in 1967. Alice had gotten very ill and Edith wasn't sure if she was going to make it. So they begin going through her stuff and making arrangements. And Edith wrote a letter to a friend of theirs. And in this letter, she said, "I want to read every scrap of Alice's memoranda that I have assembled, as well as her correspondence with me over the years." So that reveals to me two things. One, that there were letters between them, and two, that Edith had removed them from Alice's papers. And I don't know what she did with them. I don't know if she destroyed them, if she kept them, but they do not exist as far as I know. So when they pass away later in life, actually Edith goes before Alice. Alice recovered from that illness in 1967, and Edith passes away in 1970. And she was laid to rest in the Good family plot in Springfield, Ohio. And Alice was apparently completely upset by this decision. She had requested through various iterations of her will that they be buried next to each other in the family plot at the Albany Cemetery, and her family plot in the Wright family plot at the Albany Cemetery. And this never happened. And in the back of one of Alice's address books, there's like this, again, another scribbled note that was very hard to read. And I don't even know who or why she was writing this, but she basically is expressing what appears to be deep grief of the fact that they're not going to be buried together. She says, "My wanting leaves something to be desired. My writing leaves something to be desired. But I should never forget these names, Edith Good and Alice Wright. I believe there's never been a moment in all these years when I have not put these two names together. Why on earth did I not enter these two names together the last time not long ago when I asked to put us together?" So again, it's unclear what exactly happened there, but she's clearly upset over that decision. So Alice, when she passes away, she's buried in her own family plot, so they're separate from each other in death. Although their wish to be together is never fulfilled, Alice did succeed in creating an endowed trust in both of their names. It's called the Alice Morgan Wright and the Edith Good Fund, and it was intended to memorialize them together to help support the National Humane Education Society. I think that you can see through the story, right, the variety of ways that queer history can be reconstructed. It obviously leads you down a different research path. I began to spend a lot of time in probate records, death records, and cemetery records. And I found that queer suffragists often adopted, adapted, and queered heteronormative death rituals. I found monuments, I found memorials that allowed queer suffragists to preserve a memory of each other, to remain connected to their partners even in death. And I think that's really interesting. And that helped me uncover more stories like Alice and Edith's. I want to share one more story with you if we have time. And I think this is a really interesting one because it's a California specific one, the Bay Area one. This is the story of Gail Laughlin and Dr. Mary Sperry. They were both California suffragists. They were both active in the suffrage campaign here to get the state amendment for women to vote. And Gail Laughlin was an attorney, and she was sent by NAWSA, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, to California to help organize suffrage groups in California. And Dr. Mary Sperry's mother was the president of the California Association. So Gail Laughlin spent a lot of time in the Sperry family home. The two of them, Dr. Mary Sperry was a physician here in California and San Francisco. The two of them become very close. And after the suffrage campaign was over, they moved in together for 14 years. They lived together, and they moved to Colorado at one point, lived together, and then they end up coming back to California later on. And then very tragically, Dr. Sperry dies in the influenza epidemic. But what's interesting is, again, going to the death records, in her will, Sperry left her property entirely to Laughlin. And she, in fact, requested that Laughlin care for her remains. And this decision just angered the Sperry family. And it actually drove this huge wedge between Laughlin and Mother Sperry, who they had worked together on the suffrage campaign. So they contested the will in court, the Sperry family. And it's interesting because in that court case, you get more of an idea of what's happening in the relationship between Laughlin and Sperry. The Sperry family accuses Laughlin of being, quote, mannish, which is essentially code during that time period, right? And is often used against suffragists. Sperry's mother even tells the judge that Laughlin and Sperry slept in the same bed together. And so it's clear through the court records that they have this intense romantic relationships. The case is eventually settled. The court sides with Sperry's will. They agree to uphold her request. Laughlin is allowed to care for the physical remains of Dr. Sperry. The Sperry family is absolutely furious. They decide that their daughter belongs with them. So in the family plot in Stockton, they actually inscribe their daughter's name on the plot, and then they put in memoriam, suggesting that her rightful place belongs with the Sperry family. But Laughlin kept Sperry's ashes with her for the rest of her life. And she lives like 30 more years. And then when she dies in 1952, in her will, she specifically requests that their remains be interred together in the same grave in her family plot, and that both of their names be etched together on a single marker. So I went there and I took a picture. This is in Maine of their headstone. And what's interesting about this marker is I think it really does commemorate their life together. And it suggests their commitment not only in this world, but beyond, right? And it's a very powerful reminder of queer history. One of the purposes of studying history is to see ourselves in the past. And I think right now, especially in the current age, when there's so much hostility against queer people, specifically trans and non-binary people, right? It's really important for marginalized people to be able to see themselves in the past, to be able to understand this history of oppression, but also, and more importantly, I think, of survival, of persistence, of resistance. And so these stories of these queer suffragists are really important. I think it's more important now than ever to recover this history and to teach it and to pass it on. So I really hope that you have a chance to learn more queer history, to read the book, to learn more of these stories, and to share them with people, because it's a very powerful reminder of the endurance of queer love in the past and in the present. So I'm going to stop the presentation now and answer any questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Wendy. That was wonderful. Such an engaging and informative talk. Before we move on to questions, I'm going to go ahead and stop our recording.